Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Curious Neuron podcast. My name is Cindy. I am your host. And as promised, I'm here with Travis. Travis, welcome to, I don't know, I don't know how many times now. And that's a good thing because you've been here a few times. And so I'm glad that you're back with us again today.
Yeah, I'm stoked to be back on. And I think third,
I think, I don't
fourth.
know. I literally don't know. I think
I
it's third.
don't know.
No, maybe fourth.
Maybe.
But I mean, it's a good
Yeah.
sign. It means I keep asking you to come back because we love you here. So it's okay.
Yeah. And I'm glad you reached out. I was like, oh, Cindy, because we haven't. It's
It's
actually
been a while.
it's a double dip. I get to be on the
Yeah.
podcast and catch up because it's been a while. So.
I know, which we did right before. We had to,
Mhm.
I do have so much respect for your work and the knowledge
Thanks.
and stuff that you put out for us. And I would say that it's around since October that I started noticing an uptrend in posts on Facebook where I follow a lot of mom groups and parenting groups,
Hmm.
and people questioning their own addiction. If they were questioning if they probably had an addiction. They were questioning addictions of their partners and what
Hmm.
to do when they found out about something. And then I was also receiving questions myself. And so I reached out to you recently, and I do think that it's something we need to talk about because perhaps out there in the Curious Neuron community, there is a parent who has found out that something is going on in their home or with their partner, or maybe this is a partner somebody who's listening to this has realized that there might be some issues. And so I'm wondering first, is this something you've noticed? Is it something somebody had told me that it's very common around the holidays, mental health issues and addictions to go up? Is this true? Or is there more going on now?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, I think, stats that would, and you could just look this up, those that are listening, but there's definitely stats that would tend to lean toward a rise in, and we'll use the term addiction loosely here, more of a
Sure.
broad term. I think most people are thinking classics, alcohol, drugs, as the classic typical addictions, but there's so many other types of addictions that as we begin to expand, you can see how we can begin to over rely on really means of distraction to help ourselves kind of navigate and get through life, especially in the holidays, since holidays tend to have increase in stress,
Right.
increase in expectations, and financial stress to family stress to a whole bunch of and a lot of people have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stressors, and often you hear people talking about more of the difficulties around the holidays rather than kind of the joys and connections. I think
Right.
those are there, but it's more of like, oh my gosh, I got to see this and deal with this and that. And
Family members you have to get with,
it's just
meet
so
with,
much.
and it's hard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is hard. And so I think there's definitely an increase for sure, either anecdotally that I've heard just around, but also there's definitely some statistics that would back up that
Hmm.
claim of an increase in use.
So if somebody is listening to this and has an inkling of, an idea that maybe something is happening in their home with their partner, maybe even with a teenager, right? But noticing patterns,
Hmm.
what are the first steps when it comes to having a conversation with someone? And like you said before, even just using the word addiction loosely, right? Because if you go full force with the first conversation, I'm assuming there's pushback. So how
Yeah.
do you begin this conversation?
A few things that I would share, and from not only my clinical background as a trained therapist, licensed marriage and family therapist, practicing for 10 years in the state of California, along with some training I've done over the past few years through the Polyvagal Institute, treating trauma and addiction from a polyvagal lens, and I'll speak more about that in a minute,
Mm.
about kind of what that is. But essentially, if you have an inkling of an addiction going on with a family member, or maybe even yourself,
Hmm.
is I think first and foremost, there's so much stigma, a lot of negative and shame around an addiction, especially like when we
Right.
think alcohol and drugs, porn addiction, things like
Hmm.
that. And I think to some degree it's been shaped by the medical system and how we used to view addiction as primarily like a brain disease, right? The
Right.
brain disease model, which is a particular model of addiction, seeing essentially, the long story short of it, is the brain's broken, right? You have a broken brain, essentially, or you have this genetic component that, you're kind of screwed. And I'm
Right.
definitely paraphrasing that
But I get it. Yeah.
you get it. And those that are listening, please, you can look up what's the brain disease model and you can read about it. And I think because of that, there's come a lot of shame, weight to it, as well as
Mm.
like kind of a stuckness, because like, what do I do? And now there's been a lot of, we all know of AA and NA, and I think for a lot of people it's helped thousands of people to get support. But even within the model itself, I think there's some degree of I'm I'm not going to get too thick in the weeds of 12-step
Mm,
program, because I think there's a lot of good from 12-step. I think it does need an update personally, and this is my personal preference and
hmm.
opinion. But I think in the model itself is like, you essentially are broken, right? That you're powerless. And I think there's some power, by the way, of admitting that, but coming in that I'm always this kind of addict, like once an addict, always an addict. I have a broken brain. I think is problematic, rather than, I think, a more holistic lens is we need to, one, get away from the shame messaging and kind of approach it with more compassionate curiosity. I think the biggest thing is people that are struggling with some level of addiction have so much shame and fear around being found out,
Right.
about being known, and are afraid of rejection, afraid of being hurt, afraid
Mm,
of being isolated, afraid of any number of things. And so I think the first thing is, if you're yourself or might have an inkling, is starting with compassionate curiosity of trying to understand, not so much the addiction itself of like, you're drinking, you have a problem, but why? What's the why behind it? What led this person to using something? What
mm,
must be going in their life as to what this substance, and I'm using that loosely, substance, and is doing for them? What's the benefit? And if we approach it from a compassionate curiosity lens, we begin to can open the door away from shame and distancing and isolation. And we're really increasing, really, the need for most people is connection. And Dr. Gabor Mate's talked a lot about
mm,
that. Like, the opposite of addiction is connection. He's done a lot of work.
mm.
And he's Canadian as well. I believe he's Canadian, Dr.
He
Gabor
is.
Mate.
Yes.
So there you go. So he's got a
Yeah.
great book, I think, in the realm of Hungry Ghost. It's a thick read, but a great book
I haven't
on,
read that one. I'm
yeah,
gonna write it down. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, and I'll get
Mm,
back to you on that. But I'm
sure.
pretty sure that's it. Great book on addiction. Thick book, but as most of his books are. Um, but compassionate curiosity is the way to start, and I think, and that's like anything. It's the same thing with this whole podcast. Is like a lot of it's about, with as parents reaching our kids. It's like
Hmm.
approaching your kids with compassionate curiosity versus judgment,
Exactly.
and trying to adhere to rules and be adhere. Expecting obedience at
Yeah.
all times. Like, no, but compassionate curiosity opens the door to better understand what led my child to act out, quote unquote, or have a tantrum, or not listen, or
Mm.
whatever. Same thing with those that might be struggling with some level of addiction.
I love that you've approached it this way, because those are the values of Curious Neuron. And so I think it
Mm,
applies for whether we're having this conversation with our kids or our partner. And you're right about the shame. And I think that, the questions or the people I've spoken with or the questions I've received, it's almost like they're saying, what's wrong with me? Right. And then I
mm-hmm,
do think that when we look at it as the sort of lifelong sentence of like, I
mm,
am an addict, and so I am broken, in the way that you've said it, it really reminds us that we have to kind of shift that away, because feeling that way is very heavy. And so if we can
mm-hmm,
at least approach it in a way of trying to get to the why. And I think, as a reminder to everyone who's listening, that first conversation might not lead to that answer, right? Like, it might
mm,
take a lot of these conversations. What would be difficult, I imagine, is as you are trying to have these conversations, and maybe if you are trying to do it from a very compassionate place, that you're getting pushback because
mm,
of the stigma around it and the shame.
yeah.
What if you're being lied to and you could tell, right? What if there are certain things that are happening in the home, if they are drinking, if there are drugs involved, even
Mm,
if there's an addiction to a phone or a gambling problem, right? It could lead to very severe consequences within the
right.
family. And so,
Right.
at what point do you push a little bit harder, or say, I've had enough? Like,
Yeah.
how does it work in terms of that sort of place?
And that's a great question. And the the classic answer I would give is, it depends.
I get it.
Um,
Yeah, I know.
I wish there was a one size fits all for this, and this could be very
Mm,
delicate. And I think if I'm focusing on the person who's struggling with the addiction, whatever that might be, phone addiction, alcohol, drugs, pornography,
mm,
gambling, there's a lot of types of things we could use. Food, right?
right. Yeah.
Work, right? People can
Hmm.
overwork. Um, there's a story, and the better we understand the narrative as to how the person got there, the better is we're going to be able to kind of offer support and empathy and compassion. At the same time, the caveat is, dependent upon the person who might be struggling, there could also, and often is, very real negative, painful impact it could be having on the family now. And so there could be tension there. There could be a lot of
Mm,
betrayal and hurt. And so there's a lot of layers to this. One, if you're the person that's being somehow harmed or having a negative impact because of your partner, spouse's, or child's use of addiction, or you're the person themselves, is like there are layers, and understanding the story is like, I mean, this is what I do as a clinician is, or a coach, is I have to know the story.
Right.
It's not just out of the blue. They're all of a sudden stuck in the throes of addiction. It's never starts that way. I've never heard anyone, and the research would show this. They're like, hey, one day I just have an addiction problem to whatever out of the blue. Everything's fine. I have a great life. And boom, I'm in the throes of addiction. No, there's a narrative, and there's often layers, and it goes often way back to early childhood or adolescence or young adulthood, where something or some things begin to happen in someone's life. And this is kind of from a polyvagal model to kind of begin to understand what polyvagal theory is. Really, polyvagal theory is understanding the nervous system, right? Poly is many, right? And vagal, i.e. vagus, the polyvagus, right? The vagus nerve is essentially what regulates your nervous system: fight, flight, freeze, shutdown, right? And also our calm state of parasympathetic. And so this vagus nerve, if you look at it from the polyvagal perspective, addiction really can be understood as an adaptive coping mechanism that comes from the nervous system's response to lack of safety or unresolved stress. So if you think addiction in terms of that lens, that it's really the nervous system's job, which is often subconscious, trying to navigate a lack of safety or unresolved stress. You begin to see addiction issues as adaptive, meaning it's rooted in the body's attempt to try to self-regulate or escape being overwhelmed or dysregulated. And so when you see it that way, you could understand why someone might be using, why they might be going to this. And also maybe once you understand their whole story, you might begin to see when it began and then how it began to manifest even more and be used more by other experiences. And also, whether you're the person who's impacted by it or the person using, is like, it's going to give perspective for both parties, because it's more than just a brain disease. It's more than just they're broken. It's like, there's a reason. It's adaptive. Our body does its best to survive. Now, again, the other side is it can be very problematic. So it's often these two narratives that are happening at the same time. One, the very real impact it's having on the individual or the family, as well as this kind of story, this narrative that's been unfolding. And we can't really separate the two. We need to understand both. I think what happens is often we focus on the damage being done now because we're feeling it now. Yeah. We're feeling the pain now, which is very real. And for some families, very like, hey, someone's addiction problem so bad they lost their job and they can't afford now the whole family. So it could be very, very real. But if we separate the narrative, then in a way, we don't understand the human behind it. Right. And if we just only look at the narrative but don't look at the real impact, then again, we're problematic, because we're saying, okay, I understand the story, empathy, but we'll keep going, versus what's really going on. Because what's really needing is the person needs other tools or awareness, understanding of connection to more effectively regulate their state of dysregulation. And again, the whole idea you talk about with like emotions we've been on before is like, hey, when the brain's in dysregulated state, we need to help the brain get to a state of calm or calm enough to teach, right? As a parent, right? If we try to parent my kid or discipline my kid in the throes of a tantrum or emotional overwhelm and dysregulation, it's not going to go very well, right? We could throw the book at them. We could be right, but it's not going to sink in or really be that effective. If anything, it might even lead them to more dysregulation. And the same applies for those that are struggling with addiction, is that we can be right, but if we don't understand the why behind it, if anything, it might cause more shame and pain.
And sorry.
Go on. And that's it.
I'm assuming that's also the hard part, because if I use the example that you just said as a parent, when your child is dysregulated, odds are you are as well, because something has happened and you're about to lose it. And so you are trying really hard. And I always tell the parent, start with yourself first, right? Like, find a way to regulate yourself. Would you say the same thing applies to a partner, let's say, who just caught a partner who, has gambled all the money away, or they find out that they've been using drugs and that's why they're not home, and that's why whatever it is, right? Something very serious.
Right.
Do you start with yourself? Because at that moment you will attack, you will label, you will name, you will, do you step away and say, not today? Like, let's sit with this.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's such a hard, that's a hard thing to answer with one answer, again, because there's the very real, just to keep it simple, betrayal that the individual is dealing with. And so it's going to hurt. And depending upon that person's story of, have they been betrayed before? Like, Has there been a history there with this partner,
Sure.
other partners, family? And so there's going to be their own narrative of like a sense of betrayal or being lied to,
Yeah.
which is going to cause a rift, lack of trust. So there's going to be this shock.
Mm.
And so we're going to want to like either that
Lose.
person might even shut down, like,
Sure.
I'm out, like they might feel overwhelmed and be in shock, or they'll fight because they're like, what the heck, and
Of
go
course.
in, or
Mm.
cause a lot of anxiety. Again, going to the nervous system, same thing. The individual is
Mm.
going through a state of dysregulation themselves, fight, flight, freeze. And so if you're finding out, I mean, one of the, a really unproductive thing would be to go in the throes of your dysregulated state, because it's going to, you're most likely going to cause them to be more dysregulated and get stuck in shame. Then you guys are just going to cycle. Now, I understand why we do that, because we're afraid and that whole fight flight thing kicks in, but we want to take a step back as best we can, know that we have this hurt, and
Of
also
course.
how do
Yeah.
I approach it as best I can in a more grounded state, which is not an easy thing to do because you're
Yeah.
feeling this pain. And so again, just like with kids, is we got to do our best to kind of stay within somewhat of a window that we can be somewhat grounded, still feeling the pain and the distress and the hurt, but not dysregulated ourselves, because that, it just is not going to be productive. I guarantee you it won't
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
Now, it's not to say we're not going to have emotion. You're going to have feelings about it. You're
Exactly.
going to have
Of course.
emotions about it.
Don't
But
suppress. Yeah.
don't suppress. But
No.
we
No.
want to be in a state where we're at least like we have a footing on solid ground, that we can speak about our emotions rather than being ruled by our emotional states or our thoughts of the moment. And that's not always an easy thing to do. And so you might need to do a little bit of more work on your own, like take some breaths, take a pause, write stuff down, talk to a friend, like something where you're kind of able to get some of this release first,
Yeah.
and then leading up to a conversation. Because the goal, of course, would be to like, how do we navigate this and heal, right? I mean, ideally, the goal would be, hey, what the heck's going on with my partner or my kid? I love them, I want the best for them. Wow, this really shocked me. It really hurts. I can't, I have my own questions, but I ultimately love and care for this person. So we're going to have to probably heal this rift somehow.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if at all, and I know that's not always the case for everybody, depending on the story, and deal with the betrayal and be able to be raw, like, hey, this did hurt, and how do we heal this and repair, as well as how do I offer support, if at all, and get the care needed for my loved one.
Yeah.
And so it's this duality thing, which is really, it's a tension in a way that you have to live with. And that's, if I'm honest, a hard thing to do. It's not
Yeah.
easy.
And I'm really happy that you brought up the sort of aspect of the person who finds out, right? Not the person who has the addiction, because I can't even imagine in that situation the betrayal that you feel.
Right.
And if you have kids and maybe now you understand certain things and it wasn't clear to you before, but now you're also thinking there's kids in this story, right? It's not just you and I anymore. And now how do we deal with this, depending on what it is? And even just, maybe I'm thinking about more serious things, but even just a phone addiction where the couple has disconnected. And I had, I've heard of this before, where it's like a year passes and 2 years pass, and then you're like, hey, we haven't really connected. I don't know who you are anymore. And now it's too late, right? And so I think it's really important for us to, like you said, it could be food, it could be anything serious or less serious that still has a similar impact in terms of addiction. So I get that. You said something that was interesting to me. You brought up talk to a friend. I think about arguments I do have with my husband, and we have our go-to person, and I'll call my friend and be like, okay, so this happened, and this is what I said. And she's like, yeah, you were wrong. And I don't listen to it when he says it, but then when she says it, I'm like, oh, you're right, I need to go back. It's like my journal that I talk to like out loud, and it really it's this one person that I trust, that I can go to, and who will put me in my place, like if I need to be put in my place, and I can come back and we'll repair that. But when it comes to this situation, I would assume that it would feel good for the person that finds out to kind of have an outlet. But then that shame and guilt that you spoke about at the beginning, I mean, I would feel that this is something you don't want to share with anybody, but that would make it even heavier, because you're pretending everything's okay while it feels like your whole world is shattered, right? Like, how what can somebody do? Do you recommend that we do speak to somebody? I don't know. I don't even know what the question is, right? But I'm picturing myself in that situation, and I can't imagine what I would do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, with the amount of shame around it, because often we're masking and pretending things are fine, and it's hidden, right?
Right.
And so there's again, really tremendous amount of shame when it's found out or being known, and often the fear around that is being rejected, being disconnected, being cut off.
Mm.
If people knew this about me, right, they wouldn't love
Right.
me. They would
Yeah.
want and so all these narratives again around shame is such a strong emotional, mental, physiological combatant, so to speak, that
Mm.
will keep us isolated. That's really, it's, I think, shame's purpose, and I'm kind of quoting from other authors on this, that shame's purpose is essentially to isolate and destroy, is to
Mm.
keep us disconnected. And oddly enough, the opposite of addiction, again, to quote Gabor Mate, is connection. Like we need connection, and that's only going to come through. And even, Brene Brown's talked about this, right? That opposite of shame, same thing is being known, is connection, is vulnerability and authenticity. Now it's really hard, and if I'm speaking to men, that's even really big, especially around what it means to be a man, and being masculine and strong, is
Mm.
having things figured out yourself and not needing support. And again, I'm kind of speaking to the trope of like unhealthy masculinity, is that this idea of like you don't need support, do it on your own. If you need support, you're weak,
Right.
right? And so I think that's another layer for a lot of men too, is not only the shame of being known, but also what I'm not a man, or I'm not a strong man if I have to get support. And so these narratives really keep people stuck and bound. And from the polyvagal perspective, the nervous system would say, and this goes to probably a lot of the work you've spoken on too with the brain, is that being known, like nervous system to nervous system, creates co-regulation, which can create soothing to the nervous system of
Mm.
being known and accepted and still held up and accountable, which can be hard. But there's this connection piece which can help calm the nervous system down. Like, hey, I'm not rejected, because the fear, I'm in this state of dysregulation. If I'm known, then I'm going to get rejected. So I'm just going to shut down and numb out versus press into safe connection, right? Obviously, again, I think we want to be choosy with who we open with.
Yes. Right.
Like you said, we have a friend or two
Yeah.
that we might be able to do that with, um, and that person creates this kind of open, safe enough that I can show up raw and authentic, be accepted, known, and challenged,
Mm.
is really important. And I know that for a lot of guys, I would say they don't have that kind of relationship with men.
Hmm.
I would say a lot of men that I've worked with, they don't talk to anybody. I don't have a guy I could talk to. I don't talk to my spouse about this. I don't have guy friends I could talk about this. A lot of
Mm.
men struggle in isolation, which then ramps up addiction issues even more, because there's no one to talk to. And the more they get disconnected, the more sucked in they get to kind of being more alone and isolated and pulled away, because that
Mm.
shame, the fear grows, right? It like gets stronger. The more they kind of live that narrative and don't reach out to people of being known, it becomes harder, right? Because now I got to share more.
Right.
I gotta open up more, and that's just overwhelming to me. So I'm just gonna check out even more, right?
Mm. So then how, thinking about that, and if there are dads out there that are listening, or moms that are trying to support their partner right now in an addiction, um, how, knowing that connection is so important, what are the baby steps to that? And I say baby steps because I know it's not going to be about reaching out to a friend tomorrow.
Right.
What does that scaffolding or that build up to trying to make a connection look like if you haven't been doing that for so long?
Yeah, and I guess it depends on. Oh, sorry, it depends on the level of how strong is this. At what point, what kind of support are they needing?
Mm.
Like mild support to pretty significant, like a lot of support. I think if you're the spouse of one or the parent of one, it's and this is again the hard thing, because you're dealing with the very close hurt,
Mm.
again, that does need to be acknowledged
Of
and
course.
healed if it can, but also letting that person know that they are loved and cared for, that we want the best for them. At the same time, as a person continues to go into addiction, here's the very real impact it's having, and so being honest about that,
Mm.
but also knowing that as a spouse or parent, you probably aren't enough to offer support for the person, that they will often need more support outside of you. Like having you as a supportive person will be helpful, but also you got to do some healing work. So it's not always going to be easy for the
Mm.
spouse or the child, because they're also dealing with the very real way they've harmed you, whether intentionally
Right.
or unintentionally.
Mm.
And so there's like everything from, support systems, support groups, men's groups, things that focus on offering and creating spaces for men. I mean, really, it's about creating safety and safe enough, and helping. We need more environments that are allowing that.
Mm.
And again, speaking to men, because I do a lot of men's work, is how do we engage more for men that they can show up and be understood, be listened to, be accepted, as well as challenged to grow
Right.
and to challenge and accountable, right? Because like a lot of
Mm.
men need accountability, and to be able to show up and have that accountability is where a lot of growth happens, right? Because again, it's only through connection, relationship, and that's what I've seen in the men's work I've done over the years with different addictions or traumas, to varying degrees, is through relationship with other men and having a place and places to show up. It's never done in isolation. I don't think the data would. There's no data or research I would show that shows the power of isolated healing by
Mm.
yourself with no one else around you. It's going to come from connection.
And I think that's a great segue sort of into your work. And because what you're bringing up is maybe there isn't a friend in that person's environment or a family member that they trust
Mm-hmm.
enough, but there are
Right.
people out there that maybe have gone through the same thing and, can support you in that. And there's a big power in this community of strangers sometimes, right? Because you don't really
Right.
know that person. They don't know your friends. They don't know your family. And so that sort of fear of them finding out is gone. It's lifted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what is, I guess, like in terms of the work that you are doing, what is the difference between, I guess, the community that you're building with Pierre and the cohorts that we were talking about before the I started recording? But I'm curious to know, what would that look like in terms of comparing that to therapy? Because there are some men out there, just because we're specifically talking about men now, but anybody, right, who might not be open to the idea of therapy and say that there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine. You caught me. It was a moment of weakness, and I'll get through this, right? I'll be able to get myself out of this. I'll
Right.
stop the addiction. I'll stop, using. I'll stop drinking. I won't gamble anymore. Whatever it is. But with what you said, we need to find a support system. And so,
Mm-hmm.
how is that different in a community, let's say, versus therapy, for someone?
Yeah, and I mean, therapy has its place for sure, and I think it'd be definitely effective for a lot of people, and not everybody, and it depends on the place they're in. But and what therapy can offer, one thing is that there's a connection to someone else that is listening, that
Sure, of
is
course, yeah,
best non-judgment, right, and creating a space that they can show up authentically. So that's the power of therapy, is that they may be able to talk with it first time and not being totally judged, right, and I could just
yeah,
be authentic and listened to. And so, because obviously the thing with therapists is I'm not attached to the story of their impact on my life, so it's easier for me to have more reflective listening and neutral and not be so charged because it's not
sure,
my spouse, right? So it's
mm,
much easier. But that could there be a lot of power there, because that person is not responsible for the impact on me, right? If they're seeing me as a therapist, they don't have to be responsible. So
mm,
there's like a power differential there, which can be very helpful. Now, also groups, we all know the classic. If it's alcohol and drugs, there's 12-step models. There's other models out there too that are not 12-step that create community and group-based support systems. There's different types that can offer, and different times they meet. But the group that Pierre and I have created through the Men's Collective, and this is our something we've been working together last year and kind of really building this year, is a network of men, and this kind of greater thing, again, we're calling the Men's Collective. If you want to know more about it, you just go to menscollective.co. Um, but essentially, we have ongoing support bi-weekly, where we meet, and it's more coaching, but we still go deep. I mean, it sounds coaching actually goes quite deep, and
mm,
the courses we've developed go quite deep and get very vulnerable, get very authentic. But it's also around teaching core skills, and it's all about, first and foremost, connection with other men, about
mm,
creating safe space, about creating vulnerability. But it occurs through the relationship with other people, not just me and Pierre, but other men showing up. And we've curated around a lot of things that men are struggling with in our day and age. A lot of dads are struggling with today, is ideas around what it means to be a masculine man. Like, what
mm,
does it actually look like in today's world? What are our values as men? What are our priorities, and how do we
mm,
derive meaning now, right? Becoming a parent can be such a big transition of like, okay, like I was successful before with my business or whatever, and now I have a kids, and I'm finding it harder, and I'm not performing like I used to. Or maybe I was really close with my spouse, but now I'm not feeling that. And so what happens is I start to kind of lean into addictions to deal with
mm,
all this change, rather than how do I, head it face on, understand what are my values and priorities. Um,
mm,
what's my story around what it means to be a man and a dad? What has been that narrative? Because we talk about that in our course. We talk about understanding emotions and having emotional intelligence and the
Mm-hmm.
power of that, and the nervous system, of why we need to understand as men, like our nervous system, because it has so much information it provides us on a daily basis. And are we tapping into that, or are we kind of mindlessly navigating and just dealing with all just stressors all day long? And so we're creating this kind of space where we're teaching men skills by short teachings of science-based kind of understanding, with integrating this into our day-to-day life, whether we're an entrepreneur, we work a 9 to 5 job, or we're a dad, or whatever we're doing, with very practical like tools they can use. Because men need tools. Okay, what do I do if I don't do this? Why, if I'm feeling dysregulated, instead of going and drinking or numbing out on TV for hours, or social media is a big one, right? People just doom
Right.
scroll now for hours, because they don't know what to do to deal with all their stress and dysregulation. So they
Yeah.
need real skills. So we're teaching things too as well. And with that, it's being wrapped up in creating authentic connection with other men who are also trying to grow and change. So it's this accountability piece too. And I think men, from what we've done and what we've seen, is men do really, really well with accountability. They really,
Yeah.
they show up, and we go deep. We ask these deeper questions around, their, what was their model of a father growing up, and how are they changing that narrative today, and around emotional vulnerability and emotional intelligence, around purpose, around meaning, around values. Because these are things that men are trying to do their best, and at times feel like they're failing and don't know what to do. And so they
Mm-hmm.
turn to addictions as a means to cope, because they're feeling overwhelmed, or they're feeling, like, again, isolated. There's no community for them to be connected to. And again, their model growing up might have been not a very good one. And so they're just kind of just doing the best they can. And sometimes the best they can has found them in some pretty big holes. And so
Yeah.
to get pulled out of that is through connection. And that's been the biggest thing that we've heard reported back from our men in our collective and our cohorts, has been not only the teachings and skills we teach and awareness, but has really been the connection with other men across across really the US and even Canada. Is, wow, I'm not the only one. Again, it dispels that isolation and shame. Wow, I could show up and be known, and not like cast aside as like a defect.
Right.
I could be supported, but I'm also challenged, which is important. I'm challenged to grow. I'm challenged to change for the betterment of not only myself, but for my family and for my community.
That has been that phrase, I'm not the only one, has been the most powerful phrase that I heard, in the past 10 years with Curious
Mm.
Neuron. I started this as a blog,
Hmm.
started the podcast after, in social media, and that just comes up time and time again,
Yeah.
where parents, from the smallest things of yelling at your child to, very
Mm.
serious things like addiction, we often feel like we are the only ones going through this. And that sort of, those thoughts that go through our mind, like, why am I messing up all the time? Why can't I
Right.
just get this right? I think of Dr. Julie Smith's book. She talks about thoughts, and how our thoughts are not facts. But in
Mm.
those moments when we put ourselves down, they're facts to us, right? Like, I am an idiot for doing this. I'm not smart enough. Whatever it is, like, we are so hard on ourselves.
Mm.
And just, I needed to highlight that, because if
Yeah.
somebody is listening to this and feels like they are the only one,
Right.
you are not.
Nope.
No matter how small or how big the problem is, you are not alone. And you're right. That sense of community is what allows us to see that you're not, somebody else can relate to some aspect of what you're going through, and that feels good. It kind of lessens the load on your shoulders,
Mm.
and it helps. So I'm really happy that you said that. It just keeps coming up.
Yeah. No, I agree. I
Yeah.
agree with you. Yeah.
So, I'm going to put the link to what you just talked about in your program, because I do think that, the Men's Collective is something that needs to be out there more. Some people have reached out to me. I don't know about the States, but I know here in Canada, wait lists are long. And
Yeah.
so you find out that you are struggling, well, not you find out, but you say, okay, it's time for me to, do the work. And then you call
Mm-hmm.
somebody, a therapist, and they say, well, we're not even taking anyone anymore.
Yeah. They're
The wait list is
waitlisted.
so long.
Yeah.
No, there's some places not even adding to their wait list anymore. And so
Mm.
it's serious. It
Yeah.
means that there's not immediate help.
Right.
Um, you talked about connection, and I see that now as a safeguard, right? In terms
Mm.
of, don't think that you can do this on your own. Find yourself, albeit small, but anyone, internal or external from your surrounding. I'm just kind of summarizing so that people, just
Right.
make sure I understood everything. But um, what if, I don't know if I brought this up at the beginning, but just a few last questions just to make sure I've covered everything. But like, what if somebody keeps saying like, there isn't a problem. I'm fine. It's a moment,
Yeah.
right? Maybe somebody passed away, a parent passed away, and that person is struggling now to kind of get themselves back up on their feet. Maybe there was a big stress with a new child, right, coming into their lives, and now they're afraid financially, and so they're trying to make more money through gambling, right? There could be anything that comes up. But what if you're listening to this and you're like, you know what? I've had this conversation many times, and they keep saying they're fine, but then I see the counts going down. I see that they're not coming home, or
Mm-hmm.
they're coming home and they're drunk, and it's very serious. So I know you said coming from a place of compassion, at what point does, and I think now I'm speaking as the person who approaches that, their partner, at one point you might give up and say this is who they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would What sort of conversation should you be having with yourself if you feel stuck in this cycle, and there's a child there? And for my own work, what I also want to highlight is ACEs, right? And so these adverse childhood events, somebody with an addiction, somebody with mental health issues not getting the help, there might be any sort of abuse in the home as a consequence to an addiction.
Right.
I worry about the environment that child is in. So if you are somebody who's stuck in this cycle, what are you asking yourself?
Yeah. So there's, I mean, a lot of ways that, I guess to take it from the story that, hey, I've tried bringing stuff up before and the person's still in denial. Like, I guess that's the example we're using, because dependent upon, I think, again, if you start off with like compassionate curiosity, like if you're grounded as best you can, one, checking expectations that you can't really fix this person, it's their own journey, right? You're trying your best to create like a safe space for conversation, like trying to really model like, hey, this is like, I feel scared, or like I'm hurt when you do this particular behavior, like, or I'm scared when I see you struggling, and I want to understand how I can. You're trying to have all that, expressing concern, like, I know you might be using, drinking to cope with everything really hard, and I'm here to support, find another way, right? If you're doing all those and you've been having this, and definitely need to set boundaries with love. It's like, hey, like, I want to be here for you. And I'm
Right.
paraphrasing. I want to.
Yeah.
At the same time, I can't support this particular behavior that harms me or the children.
Mm.
So let's work a way to find a way forward. And if you're having that conversation, the person is still in denial and it's painstakingly obvious, well, then that's when sometimes you have to ask yourself, like, hey, what's the change I'm willing to do? If it's putting kids in harm's way, obviously,
Mm.
okay, then I might need to have pretty something radical, get support from family. I might need to move out with the kids, or I might need to, depending on what it is, like I might need to do something different because I'm having these conversations and I've tried, this kind of step of like all the things we talked about, and they're
Mm.
still in denial and denial and denial, and it's getting worse, 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 worse. That's when it's like, I do love you and care for you, and I'm unwilling, right, to keep doing this back and forth and pretend it's not
Mm.
here, because it's hurting our family. Like, we have no
Right.
money, or you lost your job again,
Right.
or you're raging when you're drunk and you're hurting us. Like, I have to
Mm.
protect now. Like, I got to go. And I know that that's a huge, by the way, decision to do that. So me
Mm.
saying this for some people is like, that's not an easy thing to make,
Of
to
course.
change. Right. And
Yeah.
so there could be a lot of fear there of like, well, what if I do that and they get worse? I mean, there's so many, that's why there's a lot of layers to addiction.
Mm.
Um, but if,
Even the fear of family members or friends
right,
finding out, like, this is what your home has looked like in the past
right.
couple of years, right? Like,
Yeah. What are
yeah.
they going to think? Right. And
Yeah.
so, but you might have to be, but it might get to a point where it's like, hey, if they're not changing, well, what are you willing to do for you, and what's okay for you? And then if you have kids involved, okay, well, what's the degree of the harm it's having to them?
Mm.
Because it's not you anymore. And so setting that is one of the hardest things, but one of the most loving things to do, like to change and say, I'm unwilling to do this anymore, whatever this is, and I need to do something different. Or until you do, like, not an ultimatum, but I want to work with you. At the same time, in the interim, I'm unwilling to do this anymore. I'm unwilling to stay
Mm.
in this house as you're raging at our kids, and and letting you scream and break things, or, as an example. So
Yeah.
when you do that, here's what I'm doing. I'm taking the kids to my mom's or dad's, or we're getting a hotel, and that's what we're doing. Or I'm kicking you out as you do that, right? In the meantime, till you cool off. So it's kind of like being very clear,
Mm.
very like love and boundaried, right? And
Mm.
And then from there, and then the next step, who knows what's going to happen if the person continues being in denial. Okay, then what? Because those are ongoing conversations. So it's hard to tell someone exactly to do.
Of
But
course. Yeah.
if that's you, definitely getting some support yourself would be good, professionally, from a friend or someone who understands addiction really well would be good for you to get your own support too. So you can have like another person to kind of think with
Yeah.
you, because it's going to be so emotionally charged if
Mm.
you're trying to also deal with this by yourself and not. And I understand trying to keep things private, and that's good. And we don't want to just like spread stuff to get, like a wildfire to people, but even be choosy with who you talk to, who can really hold it in confidence and
Mm.
support you, but also be frank with you too. Like you, and like I have friends that do that too, who could be very blunt.
Yeah.
Because we
I love
need
those
that.
friends.
Because
Yeah.
sometimes because we could get so in our mind and we're missing something, and
Mm.
sometimes it's a simple thing and we're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. You're right. But even having someone in our corner who could hear us and offer some suggestions can really help us. Like,
Mm.
hey, how do I support my husband or spouse or wife or whoever, my kid who's doing this? Like, how do I do that? And so having someone else who could really help think is going to be helpful. Because there's just a lot of weight in all this. And so um, that's what I would say is
Yeah.
you might have to really change things if the person's not changing. That could be a lot of grief too and sad if the person stays stuck. And it is a sad thing, and it could be a very painful thing. It could also feel, I think, for some, like they're choosing the addiction over you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another way to reframe that is, I don't think they're choosing addiction over you. I think they're just that stuck that
Mm.
in their own narrative and story that they're buying into the lie that there really isn't a way out.
Mm.
I think we personalize that because we love this person and we blame ourselves that if we were only strong enough or better, whatever, we could fix them. And the reality is this person has a lot of story here before us or around us that they're navigating as best they can. And at the same time, they're very stuck.
Mm.
And this stuckness might have been around for a long time, even before you came around. And so having perspective too, that this is not just about you, but it's about something else going on, or other things that they're doing their best to kind of survive. And they've been stuck in this way of doing things, and their nervous system is kind of also stuck in this kind of automatic way of doing things. So sometimes just telling someone to change is not even enough, because some of it's so subconscious and like repeated in the brain that it's muscle memory,
Right.
and
Mm.
changing takes time, and they have to trust a different process, and they have their fears too. Well, what if I do this and it gets worse? I mean, there's so many layers here. And so really, I think the core of this is that you, as the individual who found out, you need support and connection with other people. And the person who has the addiction also needs connection. I mean, the theme here is that we need people. We need relationships that are supportive, that are safe enough,
Mm.
that can challenge us, that can listen to us, that can encourage us, that can hold us accountable on both ends. And that's such a big
Mm.
need. And I know for some of us, we're isolated families, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't talk to anybody, right? And so that's, I think, one of the biggest things we need to solve is creating more spaces for that to
Mm.
grow.
Given, just to end this conversation, but given, I think about when I talk to parents and trying to encourage moving away from labels with their kids, I think about what we hear about, like, I'm an addict. Would you say, what should we change in terms of the narrative, right? Because maybe this person now, they're like, they get caught or whatever it is. And they're like, yeah, I'm an addict. That's who I am. That's me. Should we be moving away from that and trying to help them with that sort of language?
No, I mean, I wouldn't try and fix that right now. I think if
Mm.
that's a helpful stepping stone for them to help change,
Mm. So it's okay when it comes to that
yeah,
too,
I wouldn't try and
for the
overwrite.
acceptance.
Yeah, I wouldn't overwrite that. I
Sure.
mean, everyone's got a journey. I think for some people, that identification really has helped save their life and change. Now, I would
Okay.
argue, if I had them long enough, say, I think I would want to change it with them and make it more. I want to deepen that a bit more and move away from
Mm.
just a personalization to say more about the dysregulation,
Right.
that you're not an addict, that
Right.
you're a human being who found a means to try to regulate your nervous system and pain and suffering and trauma, whatever, through the use of addiction.
Mm.
But I'm not going to get stuck in semantics with someone and
Sure.
try and convince them otherwise, because I'd also don't want to take away, if that was something that was life giving, like think of like a 12-step model. For some people, 12 steps really saved their life.
Mm.
And if that's what they choose to believe, great.
Sure.
But the reality is what they found in 12-step was connection with other people,
Mm.
right? So
Mm.
that's why I think it's so successful, is that while there's some things I would like to change about 12-step model personally and kind of update it a bit on like more modern brain science understanding of the nervous system outside of an old brain disease model that came out in the whatever 40s or whenever it
I
came
know,
out,
so long ago. Yeah.
that they haven't updated it yet, that like
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to like take that from them at this point, because they are getting some of it naturally in the process. But I think a refresh would be nice to
Yeah.
be updated with the new science behind the brain and the body, to kind of get away from that disease model. I think would be
Yeah.
good. But again, I'm not going to
Sure. No,
try
I
to
get
argue
that.
it out of someone.
I was just curious to see, because I do think you're right. I think that sort of first step to kind of saying like that is who I am and I'm struggling with that and I need
Right.
help.
Right.
I think about like in the movies, right, of these like what are they called? When you get the family together and you
Oh,
have an intervention,
there you go.
right? So I think about that and it's like the first step to like getting you to realize, but it's the
Yeah.
movies, right? And so in real life, does that even happen? I don't even know. But there has to be
I
that
think they
moment.
do. I think they do. I don't know how. I mean, I don't think interventions are happening left and right, but
Yeah.
they do occur.
Mm.
But yeah, I think I wouldn't rob someone of language right now. I think if it's helping them right now go down a path of healing,
Yeah.
I would just let it be for now and just really focus on how do I support this person and understand. And again, I think the biggest thing is every person I've talked to that's had addiction issues, and I've talked with many, there's a story. There's always a story. There's always this narrative that comes together. And when you understand that, you can have more empathy and understanding and still hold the person to accountability of the impact that
Mm.
they're having right now. Because often that person's needing that. They're needing compassion. They're needing empathy and love, as well as challenge and saying, hey, this is at the same time, this is hurting. Like this does occur and this can no longer happen. Like this is something that, or I'm going to change it this way. I'm going to hold
Yeah.
myself accountable to whatever that is, because I have to do that as my boundary for you, which is also a very loving act,
Mm.
not shaming them, not belittling, but hey, I'm doing this because I love you. And I'm doing these things because this is actually tearing us or tearing the family apart rather than building, connecting. Like this behavior is actually leading to more disconnection than connection.
Mm.
And so that's the thing, is like, it's all, the goal is about connected safety.
Mm.
And so if that's what we're aiming at, how do we organize our life and our support around that idea,
Mm.
rather than just kind of isolation? So this is a really,
Yeah.
big topic, sticky topic. And there's a lot of stories and layers with everyone, all the people that are listening to this. Like there could be from a mild to severe and like this like stories in between. And so,
Yeah.
because it is like, it takes time. And so I
Yeah.
would say give yourself time and don't rush it. Don't expect change overnight. One day at a time, and then get support through sending your work and through other support
And
systems.
yours.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I do think that, and I hope actually that this conversation has at least given everybody some sort of like foundation to have the conversation and where to begin and how to move forward with this. I truly appreciate your knowledge and every conversation that you and I have had. So thank you. And I'll be reaching out to you when I have another question.
Thanks, City.
Thank you so much, Travis.
Bye.